greatest, the best, quite frankly.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming out to. Thank you all for coming out to hear this amazing conversation on Venezuela. So, a little backstory on this. This started, just after the U.S. forces were able to seize and arrest Nicolas Maduro for his crimes and bring him to justice in the United States. And so we've had a little bit of disagreement between Anthony and Will on this topic. And so we thought it would be appropriate because, we are all here on the same side. We're all part of the same movement. We're all here to achieve the same goals. And so we, as young people, as college Republicans, need to have the conversations on what's best for the nation, what's best for us, how we should move forward. So I'm going to turn it over to Will and Anthony, and we're going to open up the conversation on, is United States actions against Venezuela justified? Are they good? And should we be following the Donaghue doctrine? Anthony, you want to start us off?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having us here today to discuss this. And, like you said, I think it's important that we have conversations about these sorts of things. I think, it's important for us to remember that we can disagree and, we can be on the same side. Senator Dushik brought this up earlier that, we can agree with each other 80% of the time, but if we disagree 20% of the time, it doesn't mean that we're 20% enemies. So I think this is a healthy sort of thing. It allows us to kind of figure out what the best path forward is. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, we want what's best for not only our country, but also our generation. So to kind of elaborate on something you said there, so we had this conversation had arisen right after the events of what happened in Venezuela, and Will had spoken on the issue and had pushed back just a little bit. We had a little bit of a back and forth, but I like to think of this as a little bit of a full circle moment for us to kind of have an offline conversation, move past the character limit, and hopefully have some good insights on what's going on right now in the world, and what really is the American First way forward. So I mean, if you would like to kind of bring us into, I know you have some historical analysis you wanted to provide.
Yeah, I think this kind of dialogue is really important. And the thing about X and social media that makes it so caustic is it's one of those things where the algorithm rewards being a little more edgy. It also rewards being a little more angry, right? So I think these types of discussions amongst conservatives is going to be the way forward, especially for our generation. It's kind of figuring out our political ideology and what we want to do and how we want to run the country going forward. Just a kind of brief overview. How many people are scholars of the 18th, 19th, and 20th century foreign policy of the United States? Is this something we're interested in? Yeah, a few hands in the back. Very good. Just very briefly, we can kind of get into it a little bit later, but the trajectory of the United States foreign policy changed quite a bit after the start of the Cold War. So 1947-ish is when we transitioned from implementing the Monroe Doctrine to more of an interventionist and what eventually became preemptive, strike first type of foreign policy, where the CIA became much more involved. We got away from what made America the greatest empire the world has ever known, and we became a bully and ended up hurting a lot of countries and hurt our reputation on the world stage. And I think Donald Trump has done a great job bringing us back to the Donaghue doctrine. I think that is the path forward. So I'm interested in your takes on why Venezuela was not a good operation. This was part of the disagreement we had. I'm a big fan of Venezuela over here. Swift, it was decisive. We got what we needed to be done. I thought it was a perfect application of the Monroe Doctrine. Actually, before we get into it, who is familiar with the Monroe Doctrine? Did everybody learn about this? Okay, so good, we got forward. I'm not sure if they teach this in the United States history anymore. They're more likely to teach lesbian dance theory than actual U.S. history. So I'm not surprised that this crowd is well informed. But go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a couple things to dissect there, and just to kind of preface before really getting into this, I think we do both agree that having a free Venezuela, one that's free from the horrors of socialism, and having a country that is able to operate on free market principles and have self-determination, that's desirable. We want that, and I don't think that anyone in this room would be opposed to the idea of a free Venezuelan people. But I think we have to kind of really dig into the issues that come into play when we talk about how do you get there, and whether or not it's our responsibility, be it in on the other side of the Caribbean or the other side of the Atlantic, to be the agents of change to create those sorts of free societies. So I mean, I think we can look at Iraq, for example. We had invaded Iraq. And right, between that and Afghanistan, there was a congressional authorization for the use of military force. And that I think is one of the important linchpins of what exactly happened a couple of weeks ago. Is that, whether or not you agree with the foreign policy of intervening in other countries to pursue potentially desirable goals, you have to do it by the Constitution. And I know that we have a history in our country of fairly successful interventions as well in our own hemisphere. But we're not a country of whatever the last guy did. We're a country of laws and importantly the Constitution. And the authorization for use of military force is something that's importantly vested within the legislative branch. Yes, we have the commander-in-chief who is in charge of our armed forces, but a system which has checks and balances requires the input of the people who are most connected to our populace. Is going to be our elected representatives in the legislature. So I think that was something that primarily concerned me when I looked at Venezuela, beyond what we'll likely talk about in terms of the efficacy of doing those sorts of interventions and what that kind of results in. But first, we really kind of need to dig into whether or not we're really abiding by the principles that we should be when we're operating our government.
Yeah, I think from a legal, I agree with you entirely. I think separation of powers is very important. The legislature, though, has implemented policy to allow the president in matters related to national security or execution of our police power and law enforcement to engage in limited strikes against opponents abroad. And the left and the right have used this for drone strikes and assassinations multiple times. And the thing about a lot of these targeted strikes, and this can't be a campaign, by the way, right? It cannot be a drawn-out campaign. That obviously requires congressional approval. The president does have the authority in limited circumstances in certain scenarios to go in, to bomb people, to assassinate world leaders, or abduct them in the dead of night, which is what we did to Maduro, and quite effectively, by the way. I think this was a very clean execution of the president's police authority, and this was a law enforcement action. This was not an act of war, right? Maduro was not a legitimate leader to begin with, and his actions in pushing these drug cartels and really his actions have led to the deaths of potentially millions of Americans is a law enforcement action. So I'm not concerned with the United States marching in with a couple of Black Hawk helicopters and abducting a criminal.
Yeah, and I'll lean back on again saying that is Maduro definitely responsible and liable for a lot of the crimes against American people, against people of his own country? Absolutely. I think that needs to be put to rest immediately. But the issue then lies in to what extent does the United States have jurisdiction to perform law enforcement tasks outside of its own legal jurisdiction, being
Unlimited.
Unlimited? And why exactly is it unlimited?
Because the United States is the greatest guarantee of peace in the entire world. If the world starts acting against the interests of the United States, it is the president's duty to act against it. Period.
And where do you base that sort of duty, that sense of responsibility on the part of the leader of the United States to engage in police action, with outside of its own personal jurisdiction?
The executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States.
So the executive power is vested within the president, yes, but within its own legal jurisdiction of the country. Whatever maritime bounds we have, yes, that is kind of the furthest extent of kind of, yes, this is American legal jurisdiction, but I think we're kind of wandering in the territory of, well, do we have legal jurisdiction in another country? I mean, is that something you would argue to be the case?
I think a better question is, what is jurisdiction?
Well, now you're getting lawyery on me.
What is jurisdiction? What is force? What is coercion? These questions are matters of international law, international criminal law. The truth of the matter is, the only thing that matters in the state of nature, in the law of nations, is the use of force. There is no country on the planet that can compete with the United States military. If right now, Canada or Greenland wanted to stand up to the United States, they would be rolled over in a matter of minutes. There is nothing anyone in Europe or Russia or China could do to stop us short of a nuclear bomb. Therefore, the United States is the ultimate jurisdiction over the entire world. And the sooner that we realize that as an empire, the sooner we will realize that we can secure American peace without the need for death or long engagements, long drawn engagements. These people in Greenland, there's 57,000 people in Greenland. Europe thinks they can send 30 troops and they're gonna threaten us. It's like, what are you gonna do? They can't do anything. What is law? Law is words on a piece of paper that are written down that we mutually ensure through the use of force. What are they gonna do? What are treaties? Treaties are just an agreement that they're gonna do something. We are not signatories on the International Criminal Court for a reason. We do not want to be bound by criminal law at the international level because the only person that could enforce the law against us is us. We dragged in, George Bush. They tried to drag in George Bush to the International Criminal Court. He said no, and they couldn't do anything about it. There's a reason for that. And so yes, ultimately the jurisdiction of the entire world is the United States' jurisdiction.
So, a couple things, and I think that we can kind of put to rest any sort of considerations about potentially international law. I think we both agree that in terms of actually being a binding force against the United States, that's neither something that's practicable, nor is it something that's potentially in line with recognizing the Constitution as the kind of supreme authority to which American elected officials are responsible. But I think it's interesting to kind of consider the precedent of what's being set by kind of operating on that framework. When we're thinking about, it's interesting you brought it up earlier, thinking about the reasoning behind why we had something like the Monroe Doctrine. I think that it would be revisionist to assume that the Monroe Doctrine operated as sort of a carte blanche for the United States to have overlordship over the Western Hemisphere. It was, an intentionality to exclude European powers who, at that time, were still operating as colonial empires from influencing countries on our end of the hemisphere. Ultimately, because there was a value in self-determination, something that we fought for, strove for, and ultimately something that I think is inherent to how our foreign policy was conducted in the Western Hemisphere. For us to presume that we, by virtue of the Monroe Doctrine or whatever that supposes, have the ability to kind of enforce ourselves and enforce jurisdiction upon countries which we may not agree with. And I definitely think that, by no extent does this legitimize an illegitimate leader. But I think we need to realize that, there is such thing as self-determination, and to presume that we have authority over them simply by virtue of the fact that we have a military that's able to enforce it, I think we end up in some dangerous moral territory.
I'm not concerned with the moral territory. The ultimate moral territory that matters for the American people and for the American government is the security of the American people. We are America first. The rest of the world is full of great people. We can have strategic partnerships, right? I think strategic partnerships are important. But the ultimate security of the American people is the only thing that matters. And so if we are talking about the moral decay of invading a country by force in order to secure their boundaries so that China and Russia, if you view Russia as a real threat, but especially China, right? China is all over Central and South America. They own ports, they own mines, they own waterways, strategic routes. The Cuban Missile Crisis was such a big deal because of Cuba's proximity to Miami. This is a danger to the American people, and that's why Greenland is so critical of an asset, right? Their strategic position for Russia makes it so that not having Greenland under control is a danger and a threat to the American people. So ultimately, I'm not concerned about the morality of going in and pushing around third world nations, especially in our hemisphere, particularly in our hemisphere, if it means that the security of the American people is preserved.
So, kind of leaning into the concerns about, being America first and securing American interests so far as it concerns the safety of our people. Looking at Venezuela, yes, we removed Maduro from power, and yes, that means that he's out of the way, but his vice president is now in charge of the country, and we may not be entirely privy to what exactly is going on behind the scenes, but do you think that, what do you think really enforcing our interests in Venezuela looks like? I think we need to be wary of the fact that very clearly President Trump did say that he was not afraid of boots on the ground when it came to enforcing our interests in pursuing the restoration of American private property as related to oil rigs in Venezuela, as well as pursuing other interests in the area. I think that a lot of us we're a little too young to really kind of bear the full mental awareness of what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, but we sent American servicemen and servicewomen abroad to enforce our interests, and in the process, what have we gotten out of it? The Taliban's in control of Afghanistan, and thousands of American service members left dead in the process. I mean, do we really think it's America first to pursue a kind of policy of sending our men and women abroad in the search of trying to protect American companies' interests in Venezuela or securing our hemisphere?
So I agree with like 80% of what you said there, but I think there's a couple of terms that we need to hash out. So I'd like to go briefly through kind of the history of our foreign policy. So up until about 1947, the Spanish-American War obviously was to protect Cuba. It ended up giving us Guam and Puerto Rico and the Philippines. You had the Banana Wars that came after Roosevelt, right? There's 5 wars in Nicaragua and Guatemala, the Dominican Republic, I think. These Banana Wars were in order to secure American goods, sugar, bananas, and coffee. Highly successful, on-the-ground military operations. And I think the military operation invasion part of that is actually very important and overlooked in a lot of these discussions. 1947 changed because the Cold War shifted the focus away from American interest to just basically freeing people from communism. And that was driven from a period of people very, very scared of fascism and communism. And so once fascism was defeated, communism became the big boogeyman, and the attempt was just to push us away from communism. It pushed us away from American interventionism for the sake of American interests, purely American interests. That led to a long 30-year history of terrible, terrible conflicts. We had the Bay of Pigs failure, and by the way, that Cold War era failure was entirely driven by the CIA, and this is where the difference really starts. So it started with Project Ajax, actually, in Iran, which we overthrew the leader and instituted the Shah, and it was a horrible, horrible, messy operation. Ended up leading to Khomeini being put into power. That was a CIA failure. After that, Bay of Pigs, the CIA failed 8 different times in order to assassinate Castro, and then there was the Guatemala Civil War that we ended up starting because the CIA got involved and was sponsoring different groups, and all these covert operations in the Cold War era where the CIA came in and was like, oh, we're going to go into Chile. Well, now you get Pinochet, right? You tried this again in Nicaragua with the Contras, and you start another civil war. So every single time the CIA tried this, they miserably failed. And we got smarter in 2 occasions. in 1983 and 1989. One was in Grenada. The Grenada invasion looked very similar to the Venezuelan invasion. Very swift, we took over quickly, highly successful. And the other one, which is largely regarded as the greatest paleoconservative victory, was in Panama in 89. Again, a military ground invasion. CIA was not involved. Swift takeover, American interests were secured, we kicked the commies out. Or that is what we need to be doing, right? The difference between, actually before I get there, after that, right, for whatever reason, after 1989, with the Clinton administration, we decided to go back to our old habits, right, with the Cold War. The CIA got involved and we did massive ground invasions. And the Gulf Wars were a colossal mistake. Iraq was a massive failure. Afghanistan was a massive failure. Libya was a massive failure. All of these decisions in the 90s and early 2000s to go abroad and try to implement our regimes in countries that were not built for democracy was a colossal mistake. So we're in agreement here. But that is not the application of the Monroe Doctrine that we're talking about, right? Going to the sand and having long engagements, trying to implement democracies where they're not going to work, proved time and time again to fail. We cannot do this again. And I think that is a very distinct thing from a Monroe Doctrine application where you've got a swift, decisive movement to take over a country, restore order for the sake of American dominance in our hemisphere, right? That's what separates Kuwait and Iraq from Panama and Venezuela. Panama and Venezuela were swift operations conducted to secure the Western Hemisphere versus overseas interests that, to be honest with you, really were not American interests at all. They were part of Israel's 7 war plan, right? After 9/11, I think there was a significant American interest. We went in, we broke up ISIS. As soon as we achieved that, the job was done. And had we left after that, I think it would have been regarded as a successful operation. But instead, we decided to stay to secure Israel's interests. And so that, right, was a colossal failure on behalf of the United States. But the ultimate, argument there is that those were not American interests. Our fights in the Middle East were not American interests, and those were horrible wars. We spent trillions of dollars and wasted countless thousands of American boys for no reason. And so that's where the paleoconservatism really pushes back against the neoconservative policy of foreign intervention. I do not believe in foreign intervention if it does not serve American interests, especially if it is outside of the Western Hemisphere.
So, looking at Venezuela specifically, I think, you can look at what happened in Panama with Noriega and, say, hey, that worked. I think maybe it's just by virtue of the fact that we're 2 weeks out from the actual operation. We don't really know much of the behind the scenes on it. But, you look at what happened, and, yes, we removed Maduro, but, his VP is in charge there. To what extent, we have influence over this VP is unclear, but to me, it seems, what is the plan? Did we go in with a plan? And if so, what does that plan end up looking like? When we go in with kind of an unsteady plan, what we risk is having to do that sort of stabilization work, which is what we ended up doing in the Middle East. And I think that's one of the biggest concerns that people have, is that we do end up with boots on the ground. I think that even if we end up in a situation where, we're not deploying an excessive amount of men and women to the area, we're still gonna end up with that concern, whether it's, a peacekeeping force of 300 people or 3,000 people, because ultimately you can't govern by predator drone. You're not gonna be able to, enforce these interests without putting, men and women down on the ground. Because I am highly doubtful that we do have collaboration to a sufficient extent with the Venezuelan regime, and that, I think, is where the biggest problem comes into asking, well, what's next?
If I can jump in real quick, I think there's, obviously still a lot left that we don't know. We're not in the rooms. We don't see these conversations taking place and what the full plan is, what the full outcome will be. So I think that's actually a great place where we could leave this discussion, where we understand, both of your perspectives behind it. And we have about 5 minutes left, so if you guys are open to taking questions, 1 or 2 questions from the audience, we could do that as well.
Yeah.
So do we have any questions from the audience? Yes.
Let's say, I was gonna ask brother there, how do you respond to some people who say, even if we accept that, like, we shouldn't just topple a leader you don't like, how do you respond to the fact that Venezuela was directly harming the United States through the drug trade, through human trafficking, through communist subversion of the United States of America? How do you respond to that?
Well, I think there's a couple things you have to establish in order to kind of justify taking action. Because I think, we can definitely look at, whether or not there was sort of direct harm being performed by the Venezuelan state against our people. Firstly, like I mentioned earlier, I think that if our government does come to the conclusion that Venezuela, yes, is attacking Americans through flooding our country with illegal drugs, through providing a launching pad for our enemies in the Western Hemisphere. I think that that's the responsibility of our legislative branch to deliberate and then issue a authorization for the use of military force there to perform whatever sort of actions would be necessary to rectify that. I think also what you need is a plan. Because ultimately, we don't want to put ourselves in a position where, again, we're sinking American servicemen and servicewomen into some sort of peacekeeping operation. And that doesn't really change whether or not it's on the other side of the Caribbean or on the other side of the Atlantic. We've seen this story happen before, and we've seen these sorts of operations fall apart. And I think the biggest concern is making sure that if we're even thinking about doing this, that we're doing it by the books, by the Constitution, and making sure we're doing so in a way where we're not sinking ourselves into one of those situations, such as what we saw in the Middle East again.
Thank you. And I think we have time for one more question. Yep.
Me? Okay, Mr. Donaghue. Anthony said something about governing by predator drone, and clearly that's not going to work. We don't know much about what's going to take place in the coming weeks and months, but the one thing that we're very clear about is that Mr. Trump has said there's going to be continued American involvement in that region, and that will mean boots on the ground at some point, almost certainly, and that will mean the risking of American lives. How does that jive with your proposal that this is in American interests? Is it in American interest to risk our service members' lives abroad, even in our own hemisphere?
So, I think when we use the term abroad, we typically don't mean in our own hemisphere, right? So, it is abroad in the sense that it's no longer within the sovereign bounds of the United States. When we're talking about abroad, we're typically talking about the regions of Asia and Europe, right? Our hemisphere needs to be defended, and troops should be on the ground in Venezuela. They should be in bases in Venezuela. They should be in bases in Chile. They should be in bases in El Salvador. We should not have any Chinese influence in any region of the Western Hemisphere. If that means that we need to put U.S. bases in these regions, I'm totally for it. And I don't think U.S. service members are going to be in danger in the same way that they were in danger in the Middle East. You are not going to have, right, these terrorist factions constantly trying to bomb our service members and setting up IEDs all over the place. The Venezuelan people were very happy that the United States came in and liberated them. And I think the exact same thing will happen in Cuba as well. The United States should have bases all over the Western Hemisphere in order to protect us against Chinese influence and Chinese encroachment into our space. So I'm not afraid of putting troops down in Venezuela. I don't think they're going to be under threat largely in the same way that they would be in Islamic controlled states. And we should occupy Venezuela